Okay, so we're gonna connect the same way we did last week. I'm gonna create a variable called $con, and we'll create a new connection with the PDO library. And we want to supply the 5 pieces of information that we're using a MySQL database. Our host address, as always, is sql.computerstudies. And our database name is GC, followed by your student number.
So it's the same line as...
Yep. Don't copy and paste it. Type it.
I get it.
Then our next parameter is our database username. And our final parameter is our database password. You can copy and paste the password. You have my permission to do that. So as soon as I type my connect line, I like to go down to the bottom and add my disconnect command so I don't forget. So how do I disconnect? What do I do with my $con variable to disconnect? Vincent? Yeah, we'll just set it equal to null. So that'll free up that connection. So we've got to connect, we've got to disconnect. I'll create an SQL variable. What should our SQL query be that's going to select out the names of the video games? Okay, is it name or is it names? Remember, it's got to match exactly what's in our database. It's name, singular, and in my case, it's lowercase. Right? Here's my column in my SQL Workbench. I've got to match that exactly. If I use lowercase here, I've got to use a lowercase here. So from games. That's it. Pretty simple query. So now I'll create my command. So we'll do this in a few steps. I'll create a command just like we did on our save page. We'll take our connection and we'll call the prepare method. So this line and this line, these are identical to our save page. Right? Here's where we use them on our save page. Here's my connection. And then we prepared a command. So I'm using those exact same 2 lines of code. So far, the only thing that's different is our SQL statement's different. Rather than running an insert for creating data, we're running a select for reading data. And we'll probably write more select statements than anything else. So we've set up the command. So we'll call execute, which will run the query. And then I'm going to create a variable called games, because that is going to be used to store the data that we get back from our query. So the way we fill that, there's several different fetch commands in PHP. I'm just going to use one that says fetch all. So this then takes the results of our query and populates an array called games. So however many rows the query finds and however many columns we set up in our SQL statement, that's how many columns there'll be in that array. It's our entire set of data that we got. So no matter what we're selecting in PHP, we can use this code. Really, the only thing that's ever going to change is our query will change depending on what we want to pull from the database. And we might change the name of this variable. I just like to call it something descriptive. In this case, we're selecting games, so I've called my variable games. On a page like This one, if I was selecting listings, I'd call that variable listings just because it's descriptive. If you want to use a general name for that array, if you want to call it like $data or $results and use that for everything, that's fine, you can do that. I prefer to give it a more descriptive name. So now we need to loop through these results. Okay? So we're going to use a kind of loop that I'm not sure you've used in Java. What are our options? What kind of loops have you guys used that you're familiar with? A for, a while, a do while. You've used for each? Okay, so for each is what generally we're going to use. There are different types of loops you can use. One is not wrong and one is not right. I find the easiest one for displaying data with PHP is to use a for each loop. So for each, and I'll move my curly bracket, ending bracket, which PHP Storm writes for me. I'll put my display. My display is going to happen inside of this loop, right? Because we're going to print out one game name at a time. So we want to loop through our variable called games, right? That holds the results of our query. So games is the total set of all the data. And then I'm going to call each individual one game. So games is the entire set of data, and game is one record in that set of data, or one item in that array. You're probably a lot of you kind of familiar with this type of syntax. Again, you don't have to use these names. If there's other names that you like, that you would prefer to use, that's fine. It's not really an alias. Think of it this way. This one is the entire collection. It's all the data. And this is the current one. So that's one record in that array. So this is everything. So if this was, let's say this page was Blackboard, right? And we're selecting the student. It's showing me all the students, right? The data set would be students, and this would be student, singular. So if it makes more sense, you could call this, data set and current record. If those names are kind of describe it better for you, by all means you can use those. But that's what it means. So all we want to do now, we just need one more line of code. All we want to do now is display the name of each game. So what command are we going to use for displaying to the page? We used it last week. Yeah, we'll use echo. So now we need to access our game variable, which has the current game. And what column do we want to display? So this is how we reference it. It's just an array. So in here, we can just, this will print out that column. Now because it's an array, we could, if we wanted to, could we do this? Absolutely. That would work as well. I don't recommend this. Why would I recommend that putting the actual name of the column is a much better practice here than using the index of the array? It could be. Yeah. Any other reasons?
It's more readable for other programmers.
Yeah, it's certainly more readable for other programmers that if someone else looks at it, they know what value is going to be there.
Would it print name out if you do 0 first and name would be stored?
Well, it will print whatever. Let's say I select 3 columns in my query. 0 will be whatever I put as the first column, right? So that also means if we change the order in the query and we use the indexes, then all the values are going to be in the wrong place, right? So it's much easier to keep track of what we're doing if we actually refer to the columns by name. And then after, we want each game name to appear on a new line. So we want to put a little bit of HTML. Actually, you know what? We'll keep it simple. We won't even do that yet. So I'll just finish that with a semicolon. So this should just print out the names of our games across the screen. No formatting, no wrapping, no presentation. We're not even going to put them on different lines. It should just go around and loop through and print each name out. So I want you to save your page and upload it to the server. and then we should be able to load our game names page in the browser. I'm just gonna. So this is about the simplest possible example of selecting data and building putting dynamic content we could possibly create. It's really not possible to do it in fewer steps than this. The good news is, even if our query is really complicated, our process is really the same. So I'm not sure that I did it right. I better check my page in the browser. I'll put my code back up. So now if I just go to my game names, so there's our no formatting dynamic content, right? All the content of this page is coming from here. Now, we could write a few lines of code here. If you wanted, you could put your SQL query right here. We don't need a separate variable. I just find the code is cleaner and easier to debug if we set up our SQL variable separately. So, technically we could just put the SQL statement right here. I find this process is simpler to break it up. So all of the pages we're going to write this term, whenever we're reading data from the database, this is our process. You had a question?
How would we do an echo new line?
Great question. Okay, let's change it. How would we change it? So rather than our game names running across the page, we'd at least get each one on a new line. What would we have to add on after we display the name of a game? Yeah, what HTML tag would give us a new line? Yeah, so we'll want to put in a BR tag, and we'll need to concatenate or append that on. We talked last week how PHP has this really goofy append operator. What do we use for concatenating in PHP? It's a period. So after my bracket, if I put in a period, and then open up quotes, I can put in a line break. So print the name, and then print HTML so that I get a line return. Sorry, I just have to. So I'm going to re-upload my game names page. So now we get that line break printed out, right? Now our content on our page is dynamic, right? Most of the content's coming from our database, although we have a little bit of HTML. But remember, if we view the source of our page, the end user, they only see the HTML output. All our PHP code that we're using, all the logic, our SQL query, our database credentials, all of that stuff stays on the server. The end user doesn't see any of it. All they see is just an HTML page. They just see the output that we controlled.
They don't understand all the work.
They don't see the magic, right? You guys are the magicians, right? This looks like magic. How did this stuff get here? Well, all we did was write a little bit of server-side script to do it. I want to show you one other important thing. Several of you have had some issues, and some of the issues you've had so far is that the name you've used here doesn't match the name in your database. So what happens, let's say I put in a capital N on name. Now my database, the column's called name with all lowercase. What's going to happen if I save and upload my file and refresh the page? What result do you expect to see when I have a capital N here? So let me just upload it. Before I refresh it, am I going to get a blank page And am I going to get the games printing out the same way, or am I going to get an error? Which one do you think is going to happen?
You're going to get an error, fatal error.
Fatal error? Well,
Line 25.
let's try. So what happened? Yeah, so this is one of the ways, remember I said we talked about PHP being flexible. It's good and bad. It's good because my page didn't crash, but it's bad because my page didn't crash, right? If the page crashed, somebody would report an error and I know I did something wrong. In PHP, it just prints out, if it doesn't recognize that value, just prints it out as a blank. Most other programming languages would give me an error. It'd say there's no column called capital N name, and it would give me an error. That would be good because then I would know to go and fix my code. Here, the values just don't show up on the page, but it doesn't die. Now notice, I'm going to try doing it here now. If I do it in my SQL query, right? So I've called it capital N in my query. So again, this is a mistake. This is an error. This should be lowercase. Let's see what happens now. Anybody want to guess? What'll happen when I refresh? Error, blank, or I'll get the names. I didn't see anything. So it just doesn't run the query. We get no results here. But it didn't tell me my SQL is wrong. So here's a quick debugging tool for you. I'm going to add something on here. Above this line of code, we should add this. This actually gives me an error. If I copy this SQL command, I'm going to copy it to my clipboard. I'm going to paste it into Workbench. What's going to happen when I try and run this query here? Oh, yes, it works because I'm on Windows. Windows isn't case sensitive. If I do this on the server, let me do this in my browser on the server. On the server, which is Apache and is case sensitive, I should get a different result. I'll try and run it here. Okay. All right, well, I guess these know to translate it, but in my PHP page, I'm a bit surprised by that result. I expected to get an error, quite honestly. But here, I get no data, right? My query won't run. But I don't really know why it doesn't run. I'm not getting any clues. There is something we can turn on an attribute of our connection. So right now, by default, if we have an SQL error, the SQL error messages are getting suppressed. That's the default on the server. I don't want those error messages to be suppressed. I want the page to crash so I know what to fix. So here's how we do it. Just before my connection, I'm going to add one more line of code. So I'm going to turn on SQL debugging. So here's how we do it. We take our connection and we're going to call this built-in function of the database connection called setAttribute. Just bear with me for a minute because I have to remember the exact syntax. It's not curl hot. I should remember, but it's been a little while and I want to get the syntax correct. So bear with me. just look it up. Error mode exception. This is what I want. PDO ATT error mode. Okay. PDO. So what we want to set is the error mode. So what this does, by adding this line of code, it will show us any errors in our SQL commands. By default, the Apache server won't show those to us. So it's probably a good idea for any dynamic pages we write to include this attribute. So if we mess up our SQL, we'll get an error message. So we're turning on the error mode by setting it to exception, meaning if an error's happened, don't suppress it, display that message. So in my code, I still have an error in my SQL, right? I've capitalized the N, which should be lowercase. So when I ran the page this way previously, I just got a blank screen. I got no data, but I got no error. By adding this attribute, if I re-upload my file, I now should get an error message telling me what's wrong with my SQL command. So I'm going to try that out. I'll put the code back up. So now if I refresh, I still get nothing. Why exactly, I am not certain. So I'm going to put my code, actually I'm going to try one other. I'm going to try capitalizing my games table. We'll see if that gives me the result I want, if that will crash it. So now I get this error. Notice I changed my table name to capital G, and it tells me base table or view is not found, games doesn't exist. Now obviously once our site goes into production, we're not going to want to show people this, but when we're developing, this is helpful. So I'm going to put my code back. I may as well make it correct again. But we're going to use this turning on the debugging while we're developing, so that'll make it easier for us to find our errors. So when I correct my code, now I get my data properly. So our game names page is done. What we want to do now is rather than just show the names, we want to display all of the fields from our database, and we want to set it up in an HTML grid, tabular data, which is something I don't think I've ever built a web application that doesn't include dynamic data in a grid. So, what would this look like? Well, here's the front end of this website, but if we look at the back end, all we're going to see are a series of pages with tabular data and forms. So here's a peek at what the back end might look like. Right? So for managing news, here's a grid with the news page. They want to create something new, they get a form like we built last week. They have a new house to sell, here's the list of houses for sale. They can add or they can go and edit. Rentals, content. These are all, it's all the same code. We're just selecting, running a different SQL query each time. And we're building a table with different columns depending on what we're selecting. So this is typically what a website, simple website control panel might look like. A bunch of forms for creating and editing data, and then a bunch of pages that have grids for viewing or deleting data. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going with this. So let's make a new page, create a new PHP page, and we'll just call it games, plural, because it'll be used to display all of the games. So new PHP file called games.php.
In the same lesson?
Yep, same lesson. All the files we make will go in our lesson 3 folder. So make a new PHP file, call it games, plural. Games with an S, because we already have game without an S. I'm going to delete what's here. We'll set up our basic HTML template. So the same stuff, we'll put on a title of video game listings. So this is the same as all our other pages. The only thing we've done is we've given it a descriptive title, so it'll show up in the browser at the top. So let's put on a heading. We'll put on an H1 tag. It says video games. So the process of what we doing here is almost identical to what we did on our previous page, right? We're going to have to connect. We're going to have to set up an SQL query. We have to execute that query. We store the results in memory. We'll loop through the results and we'll display the games one at a time, and then we'll disconnect. So there's really only two things that are different. Our query will be slightly different because on this page, we were only selecting the name. This time we want to select all of the columns. We also want to show the age limit, the release date, and the size for every game. So that's the first thing. Our line 18 is going to be changed very slightly. What's the other line number that we'll have to change? We'll also have to add a few things, but there's one other line here that's going to have to get modified a bit. Yeah, the echo command, right? So here, all we did was print the name, and then we printed a break. So in this case, we're going to need to be printing out each value, but we want to put each value into a new cell of the table, so we have a grid of rows and columns. So we're going to need more HTML tags. We won't use line breaks. We're going to use several different tags that are involved for creating tables, which I think you probably may have done a little bit last semester with Scott in your Web and Internet Fundamentals class. Do you guys build HTML tables at all? No? Okay, well, I'll show you we need the tags. So, sorry? Okay. So, we need to talk about this process for just a second. We said this is dynamic, so this is a list, an unordered list. Here's another unordered list styled differently. In fact, all of these are really unordered lists. When I showed this site control panel, we saw grids. In every case, we're running a query, we're looping through, and we're displaying the data. So in effect, all we're doing by using different HTML is we're actually just wrapping the content differently. Right? Whenever we have dynamic content, whatever HTML tags we use to display it will control how that content's formatted. I like to think of it this way. Okay? If you're going to get a gift for somebody, you've got different ways of wrapping that same gift, right? What options do you have? You're going to wrap a gift. Let's say you're buying somebody a bottle from the liquor store. What options do you have for packaging or presenting that? Okay, so here you go, right? So that's this approach. No wrapping at all, really, right? There's no formatting. Here you go, here's your bottle. What else could you do?
Put in a tube.
You could put it in a tube. What else could you put it in? Duct tape? What else could you wrap a bottle in? Wrapping paper? What else?
Pretty much anything.
Such as
Invoice,
gift bag, a box,
aluminum foil.
aluminum foil, newspaper, right? It's still the same thing inside, but you can present it, you can cover it different ways. So how it actually looks is different, even though it's the same thing inside. So it's the same thing with our echo line. We're always going to be displaying our array from the database this way, but the HTML tags we use around it will determine what that looks like. So it might appear, our data might appear in a grid, it might appear in a list, it might appear in a drop-down. Our data might appear as images, like in a photo gallery. In every case we're looping through, we're just using different HTML tags as think of it as the wrapping or the packaging. So that's what we're gonna play with. So we're gonna build this as a grid, and then before we leave today, we're gonna build a separate page where we can get all of the names, but we wanna put them in a drop-down list instead. So the user can actually pick a game from a drop-down. So we're just going to use an HTML tags to put those names of games as options in a drop-down list. Okay, so we'll do all of those today. So let's put on our comments here. We'll put on our PHP tags. And again, we'll write all the comments. So step one is going to be the same. We're going to connect. We'll write the query to fetch the game data. We'll run the query, we'll store the results in memory, exactly like we did on the last page. We'll loop through the data, creating a new table row for each game. Actually, this will be a multi-line comment. And putting each value in a new column. So we're going to need some HTML wrapping in order to create rows and columns. And we'll disconnect. The other thing, we're going to do a couple things. Actually, before we loop and after we loop, I'm going to put in two other comments. We'll start the table and add the headings. We'll do that before our loop. We want one row at the top that has column headings, like this row here. We'll want that at the top. We don't need it inside our loop because we don't want those headings printing out repeatedly. We just want it at the top of the table. And then after we're done looping, before we disconnect, we can close the table. So most of what's happening here we've already done today. The only things we haven't done is we haven't looked at the HTML formatting we need to create the grid of rows and columns. So I'll connect again, and yes, I'm going to type it out again. And I'll turn on my debugging as well. Optional step, you don't have to do this. So if I mess up my SQL, I want that error message to show on the page so I don't just get a blank screen. So these are just constants in the PDO library. We're setting a value for the error mode constant. It's an enumerator. We're setting it to show exceptions. What's our SQL query going to look like? How do we get everything from the games table? Yeah, we'll just select star from games. So the only difference between this query and the last page is we just replaced the word name with a star. We'll get all the columns. Our next 3 lines are exactly the same. We're going to create a command, we're going to run the query, we're going to store the results in an array. So these 3 lines we used here, we're just going to repeat them because we're doing the exact same thing. It's just that the query results are going to be slightly different because we have more columns. And again, we may as well use the same variable called games because that's what we're selecting. That describes our data. So after line 24 runs, our query should have executed and we should have all of the game data stored in this array called games. So everything's the same as the previous page except for line 19 where we just modified that query very slightly. Does anybody have any questions about anything we're doing here so far? We're still going to get it to do another example later because when we work on using a drop-down menu, we still have to follow all of this code. This part's all the same. So now we need to figure out what tags do we need. And we're going to need about 5 or 6 different HTML tags in order to properly build and format this table. Does anybody know any of the tags that we're going to want to use? What tag do we use that will actually create the table?
Table?
You got it. We got a table tag.
And here?
Okay, what does a TR tag do? Right, so that will create a new row, and we want, so rather than using BR tags like we used on the last page, by ending a row at the end of a game and then starting a new row inside our loop, that will automatically create new rows, a new row for every game. So if we have 5 games, our table will have 5 rows. If we have 50 games, we'll have 50 rows. Any other tags we're going to use?
TD?
Okay, what is TD, Deepak?
I don't know full form of that. Column. That's some table, yeah.
TD stands for table data. It basically means a column. So inside of a TR, set of TR tags, we're going to have how many sets of TD tags are we going to have in this table? 4, because we've got 4 columns, right? Name, age limit, release date, size. So we'll have 4 open and closing. We'll also use a couple of other tags, 3 other tags. We'll use T-head, which is for the header row, and then TH. TH and TD are basically the same, but this stands for table heading. So this will automatically, for example, make bold the heading rows. And then we also will set up a table body, which we only need 1 of. So these 6 tags will allow us to create a grid of rows and columns. So what I want to do is create the table. I'm going to recommend you use single quotes, and I'll show you why in a minute. You can use double quotes, but here's why I would want to use singles. So I'm going to put in a table, And what I want to do is give the table a border so that there's grid lines around each row and column. So if I add border equals, sorry, we'll make it 1. So the reason I'm putting this whole thing in single quotes is so I can use double quotes here and I don't have to escape them. Because whenever we output HTML attributes, so we have a tag called table, it has an attribute called border. When we give it a value, that value should always be enclosed in double quotes. So now we'll put in our table head. That creates the heading row. And now we want 4 sets of TH tags to create our 4 column headings. So my first column heading will say name. Second one will say age limit. I'll wrap this down to another line. Whoops. But I shouldn't break my tag. Our third one is release date. And our last one is size. And I'll finish that command with a semicolon. So these TH tags, that's going to create these headings here at the top of our table. Creates a new table, creates 1 row with 4 headings, each one in its own column. I'm going to leave the loop. We'll come back and finish this after, but down here to close my table, and I'm just going to add one other thing. Then I'll open my table body. But I don't want to close my table body there, so we're just going to start the table here before our loop. Then we'll loop through, we'll output all the games. We'll come back and we'll do that part after the break. But to close our table, we'll close the table body and close the table. So we create the table before our loop, we put all the data in the table using a PHP loop, and then we finish and disconnect. So we'll set our connection equal to null. So I'm going to try my page now. The video games won't show up, but I want to make sure my table heading with the 4 column names prints correctly. And then we'll take a break, and then we'll add in the code in between opening and closing our table to display the video games. So you can save your page, upload it to the web server, and try it out. I just need to pause mine for